Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast with Kate Riga. Yesterday, we did an Instapod, kind of a breaking news podcast, because the Georgia Trump coup indictments had come out the night before. And when I mean night, I mean like night, like not like 6 p.m. or something like that, but not quite the middle of the night, but late in the evening. So we did a first go on the range of issues that this new set of indictments has brought up. But today we are joined by one of our colleagues here at TPM, Josh Kovensky, who is the lead reporter on, Trump felonies, for lack of a better word. And I guess I would say lead reporter, since they have become such a pervasive part of the political conversation, the political reality in this country, that we're all kind of like reporters on this case. It's not an obscure beat. It pervades everything. And just as an example of that, today, we're going to talk about the new indictments. We're also going to talk about what's going on in Iowa, which on the Republican side is still the first primary contest, not technically a primary, but and they have this whole thing where the Iowa State Fair is a big thing, uh, leading into the political contest in Iowa, and it's sort of a gauntlet where all candidates have to try to eat like obscenely large corn dogs, as and get through it with their dignity intact. So we're going to talk about that too. We're going to talk about this new New Hampshire poll, which substantively doesn't seem that dramatically different in terms of what it's showing. It's still showing like, Trump as sort of like the favorite of everybody. He's like at least 40 points ahead of everybody else, even in a state that the way that New Hampshire works politically, that shouldn't be a great state for him, right? It's you have a lot of Republican leaning independents there. It doesn't have the Southern Bible bait Bible Belt um, demographics and political culture, whereas really, which is where he really knocks it out of the park. But still, he's like killing everybody there. But the point is that he's actually it's not him. It's that Ron DeSantis has actually, at least technically, fallen into third place. Chris Christie is now a point ahead of Ron DeSantis in New Hampshire in this new poll. Now, in a in a political contest in which one guy has like 50 or 60% support and everybody else is just kind of getting the crumbs at the edge of the table, the difference between 8 and 9% support is in reality a kind of a polling artifact. But still, if you're Ron DeSantis, you don't want to be falling into third. And this is probably a sign of things to come. But I mention those two things we're going to be talking about in addition to the indictments, because what is happening in Iowa, what is happening in New Hampshire, what is happening in the in-state and national polling contests in this primary contest on the Republican side, or really anything having to do with the 2024 presidential election, or anything to do with American politics, is just intimately, inextricably connected to these indictments. We have, needless to say, we have never had a former president or a presidential candidate of any standing facing criminal charges while they are running. We have never had a former president charged with crimes that they committed while they were president, right? Remember, we started off here with the New York City charges about the sort of you know, filing false records and tax fraud tied to these payoffs of Stormy Daniels. that happened like 10 or 15 years ago. That's like ancient history, right? It's something that happened long before he was president. And the Mar-a-Lago documents case is something that happened after he was president. So it's only these coup cases that go to things he did while he was president. So as Trump sometimes says, no one has ever seen anything like it. Well, we have not ever seen anything like this, and certainly we have not seen it where he is facing criminal felony indictments in four separate jurisdictions at the same time as we go into the presidential contest. So I want to jump right to it here and get to Josh so he can kind of get us into the details of this new indictment. And one of the things I'm interested in is, um, how a lot of what is charged in Georgia overlaps with what was charged at the federal level. This set of indictments is obviously Georgia focused, but it brings in acts that happened in other states. It brings in acts that happen in Washington, D.C. And even though it kind of wasn't the focus in how the indictments were portrayed in the media, the federal indictments also cover a lot of stuff that happened in Georgia, just as part of this larger pattern. So, Josh, tell us well, first of all, was there anything in this set of indictments besides the fact that like everybody got indicted? There's 19 people facing indictments. Are there other things there that what surprised you about it?
So I think I would say two things, Josh. And first of all, thanks for having me on. The first surprising thing is less kind of factual and more just approach based. And that's just that Fani Willis decided to say that, kind of the entire election attempt, or rather the entire attempt to reverse the results of the 2020 election was a criminal conspiracy. And so to, make that point, she drew in a lot of different schemes that have long been seen as kind of separate. So fake electors scheme, all of the attempts to get various state officials and state lawmakers to flip the result, intimidation of Ruby Freeman, the kind of harebrained voting machine theft caper situation with Sidney Powell in Georgia. She basically used that statute to say this whole thing was just one conspiracy, kind of coalescing around one guy, Trump, with one aim. So that was, it wasn't entirely surprising, but it was interesting and it framed up the, I think, election attempt in an interesting way. Factually, this isn't necessarily a new fact, but the way that Fani Willis laid this out in the indictment, I found really striking, which is I think our listeners will be familiar with the kind of infamous December 19th meeting at the White House. We had Michael Flynn, you had Patrick Byrne, you had Sidney Powell kind of all appear, and everything went sort of insane, right? And during that meeting, Willis mentions one thing that was discussed was making Sidney Powell special counsel to go and try to investigate, seize voting machines and investigate like all these really chimerical, insane claims of fraud. But the way that Willis lays this out in the indictment is that then over the next few days you have Powell and Meadows and various other people immediately acting almost as if she was appointed special counsel. So the next line in the indictment is that the next day Sidney Powell goes to Georgia and starts trying to get data from voting machines that she's trying to seize. You also the next day also have Meadows going down to Cobb County trying to observe an audit that's going on in progress. So I think there was less new specific kind of new factual information and more just ways of framing it that were really interesting and really tight. I think just brought home kind of how willing the people were, at least allegedly, to act as if they had authorities that they just did not have.
Yeah, speaking of Meadows, we talked about yesterday how, it was interesting to see his name there among the kind of conventional wisdom that, he's long flipped, he's working with anyone who will take him to try to save his own skin. What did you make of him being kind of among the many indicted?
So it was interesting because they only hit him with two charges. There was the overarching RICO conspiracy charge, and then there was a solicitation charge, so soliciting a public official to violate their oath. And the only thing that Willis tied him to there was him being on that January 2nd call with Brad Raffensperger, where Trump said, just find me the votes. I just need one more vote than the 11,000 I lost by. And just historically great moment. But it's also I think with Meadows, I think that charge though is seen as thinner than the rest of them, partly because just as laid out in the indictment, you have him there, but that's really the only moment where you have him directly tied to the scheme. I don't know if that says something about his cooperation or just his exposure. Was he smart? We know he has a really great lawyer. It's just not clear to me what that kind of says about his own actions and how exposed he actually might be to charges in this situation.
Did you see there was a this guy down in Florida who is former Trump supporter and now a big DeSantis guy, went on Twitter yesterday and said that Jenna Ellis, who is also indicted here, is not only not indicted at the federal level, but is not, at least to the best of our understanding, is not one of the unindicted co-conspirators, that she is indicted here, and according to him at least, the Trump crime family, as Republicans might say, is refusing to pay for her legal bills because she has been at least DeSantis curious, if not identifying as pro DeSantis. Do you know anything about that? Do you know who is representing her? Do you have any sense of kind of where she is on that front?
She has an attorney that she retained. She is fundraising. She has a public, it's not GoFundMe. I forget the conservative version of GoFundMe, but she has one of those to try and raise funds for him. That resonates with something I heard kind of while reporting on the Jack Smith's and the pre-indictment phase of Jack Smith's investigation into the fake electors, which is that if you look at the people who were kind of involved in that scheme back in 2020, some of them are still Trump loyalists, but others have gone to work for DeSantis. And I basically heard from various people that there were these interesting situations where that caused people to sort of throw each other under the bus, depending on whether or not they were, working for DeSantis now or working for Trump. I think there was one really notable situation with that. I think in Adam Laxalt, who Nevada politician, who I think is now in charge of some DeSantis organization. So it wouldn't surprise me if that's the case, just because we've already kind of seen that similar kind of tension bubble up in other parts of the investigation. And I think Jenna Ellis herself she's basically been critical of Trump in her advocacy for DeSantis. She said that, DeSantis it gets more stuff done. So it wouldn't surprise me if that's accurate.
It's an interesting decision, and sounds like a bad decision for Trump, but it's not unlike what we saw with Michael Cohen, where one of the reasons that Michael Cohen turned on him is he wasn't, if I remember correctly, he wasn't refusing to pay his legal bills, but he was sort of nickel and diming him on that Cohen had to kind of beg, and he was sort of, in that sense, Trump was sort of signaling that he wasn't going to be there for him. But certainly, the reason that, at least in the other federal indictments, that Trump, I think in most cases, it's like the super PAC or the campaign. The reason they are paying this stuff is not to be nice or if you're thinking to reward loyalty, it's to keep these people quiet, right? So it's like the joke's on him if Jenna Ellis, who one would imagine has to, beyond what we see in the charges, she was literally in lockstep with Rudy Giuliani through all of this. So it's hard to imagine that she doesn't face not only the jeopardy that we see just in the indictments, but that the case against her is pretty strong because she was at the center of it. So if she, isn't able to fund her own defense and she starts cooperating, the joke's on Trump.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I would, it's true that she was alongside Giuliani throughout all of this. She kind of came out of nowhere, if you recall, in November 2020, and became this spokesperson, one of the many legal spokespeople for the effort to reverse the election result. But I think one thing that's come out in the reporting, both reporting and also just the indictments, is that she, unlike John Eastman or Ken Chesebro, she was there. She was kind of like a bystander in a sense, and pro Willis, a participant, but she wasn't like a mastermind, right? It didn't seem like she was one of the people who was really kind of digging deep to try to come up with these way out there outlandish legal theories that ended up being so destabilizing. So, I think I think it's worth drawing a distinction between things she may have seen and heard and things she may have actually kind of participated in orchestrating.
Right. Well, I guess there's the distinction there between masterminds, people who come up with the plan, and people who are executing the plan, even if they're executing it in a merely functional sense. It's certainly been, I mean, one of the, I can't remember, I was revisiting something we published. It may even have been, uh, you know, before January 6th, even while a lot of this stuff was still percolating in the background. And it was basically about how she came out of nowhere and seemed to get Trump's attention because she had been going on Fox as a constitutional lawyer, whereas in fact the only thing she had ever done as a lawyer, kind of working as a lawyer as opposed to a few kind of like think tank sinecures, was basically being a working in a DA's office somewhere in Colorado, and doing kind of traffic violation
Right.
stuff. So, this was not someone who was like, the thing you can say about certainly with Chesbrough or Eastman, these were people who, came in with a lot of like lawyer credentials. And, Giuliani's another question, but I mean, he was a U.S. attorney ages ago, right? So definitely a player in the Reagan era, law enforcement legal world. So she wasn't one of those people.
Right. And I think that gets on something important about her, Josh, which is that this was sort of my impression of her was always that this was like her ticket in, kind of, that, helping out with like the Trump stop the steal stuff was sort of like it was her way to become like a big conservative media personality.
Right.
And maybe, who knows, maybe a politician down the line, who knows, right? Like this was like the thing she had to do to like kind of get in that world. But
Right.
you have guys like
hazing, sort of like.
Yeah, sort of.
Right.
Like, yeah, like baptism by like filth. I don't know, but like, with guys like Eastman, Chesbrough, Giuliani to an extent, it's like not only have their careers kind of peaked, but like they've already kind of been on this weird sort of like all of them in this like downward slide, like in like a ignominy and obscurity. And this was in some ways it just sometimes feels like the stop the steal stuff was like a weird like revenge lashing out for all of them.
Right.
But with all, it's a little different. It's true.
It's funny in Roman history there is a concept that you see a lot in cases where you have sort of like would-be dictators, right, or demagogues, public demagogues, and much of the Roman history that we have is written by conservative patricians, basically, kind of old money, writing about the Republic, writing about the early empire. And like there's this one guy, Catiline, who is a very Trump-like figure, right, in the history of the late Roman Republic. I know I'm going a little obscure here and out on a limb, but just work with me. In any case, as it's portrayed, particularly by Cicero, who's the guy who kind of brings Catiline down, that Catiline's support is all people who are like down on their luck. People who maybe were making something of themselves at one point, but it went wrong for them, and they're desperate, and they're mad, and they're people who are in debt, and all this kind of stuff. And if you study Roman historiography, the idea is that maybe it wasn't quite that way. Maybe this was a more kind of populist thing against the sort of the ruling oligarchy that ran Rome, and that all this stuff about desperation and debt and all that kind of stuff, that's the patrician's view. And yet you see with Trump, that's pretty much exactly how it is. And we're seeing it live, right? And it is a funny thing that they are all people who are down on their luck, looking for an opportunity that they have not been able to get through kind of the conventional processes, whether it's as a lawyer or a politician or whatever, or a business person. And Trump is their ticket, because you got to be willing to do anything for Trump, and they are willing to do anything. And it's a remarkable thing, because it's made me sort of rethink my own thought about those about that kind of ancient Roman history, because it really does fit the mark. very much. In any case, huge digression. Kate, do you have other questions you'd like to ask us?
Yeah. So one thing that's come up now in the, I guess day since the indictment came down, is that everyone kind of assumes that the Trump team is going to try to get this case moved to federal court. And I guess Mark Meadows has now moved to do that. But what can you kind of tell us about that? And if, do you think he'll be able to move it? And if he does, is that really like a kind of ticket out of trouble card for him?
So one thing I'll note with Meadows, just first off the bat,
Mhm.
is that it's interesting that he just the first day after indictment just went ahead and filed that by himself, right? He didn't wait to like file with any of the other defendants. So that tells you something right there, I think. With Trump, I think what's interesting about this is that from the people I've read and spoke to a little bit yesterday, um, the real benefit here is that if they move it to federal court, it's not so much like banking on getting like some version of Judge Eileen Cannon in
Mhm.
the Northern District of Georgia. Rather, it's that the jury pool in Cobb County is going to mostly come from, Fulton County is mostly going to come from Atlanta, right? So it's a heavily Democrat district. But the Northern District of Georgia encompasses all of the rural areas around that, around Atlanta, right? So the jury pool is going to be much more likely to be mixed, and like they're just gonna have a better shot with that jury. Um, so that is my kind of read on why they're trying to do it. As to whether or not they're likely to succeed, I have no idea. There's like a fairly obscure federal statute from like around the founding period, like I think it was 1790s when this was passed, basically saying that like um, it was yeah, it was 1789, and it's that you can't prosecute, basically saying that in certain situations, state prosecutions of federal officials have to be moved from state court to federal court. In that case, it would still be the state prosecutors bringing the case. It would be federalized, but I don't think there's like a ton of case law here for kind of obvious reasons, and I just can't really give you a read on whether or not this is like
Mhm.
likely to go through or whether it's likely to stay in state court.
Yeah, the other logistical thing that I've been thinking about that we talked about yesterday a little bit is how Willis said she wants to try all 19 of the defendants together. Um, I mean, do you have like any sense? It just sounds like that's going to be so chaotic. And when when you kind of follow these dockets like you do, like we do, even with kind of smaller cases, it's just like the logistical parts of holding trials. It just seems like a constant nightmare to get everyone to like respond and file all your stuff and blah blah blah. And it's like that to a factor of 19 just seems like it would be so unwieldy.
Yeah, and obviously Trump's interest here, and as in like every other legal proceeding we've ever seen him be involved in, is to delay it as much as possible, throwing everything against the wall. Interesting nuance here, though, I think, which is that because this is not subject to pardon, he is deprived of a critical piece of leverage that he does have with potential co-conspirators in the federal case, right, or potential
Mhm.
co-defendants. So that I think is going to change things up a little bit, not so much with speed, but just in terms of how this plays out, where you have a guy like, I mean, like so we talked about Jenna Ellis earlier, right? In theory, Trump could, if this were a federal prosecution, Trump could try to guarantee her loyalty, as he has done many times in the past, by saying, "Look, help me out. If I get reelected, you get a pardon." But that's not going to play in this case, because even if it is federalized, like we just discussed, it's not going to be subject to the federal pardon power, because it is at the end of the day still a state prosecution, and there is no.
And that point's really key. That
Yeah,
as you said, that it's still not in the federal system. It's just run in the federal courts,
right.
and that's sort of a normally that's a kind of a weird distinction. But as you said, it's not pardonable. It's still the state prosecutors. As you say, it really comes down to a jury pool, at least in terms of the intent. It seems
Totally.
to come down to a jury pool issue.
And so Trump, I mean, we are like, as you said at the beginning, Josh, like very much like uncharted waters. Like we don't know how this would interact with him potentially being elected and having this like state, potentially state conviction or ongoing state prosecution hanging over his head. But I mean, you could see a situation where he buys himself 4 years of time away from the Fulton County prosecution, but everybody else involved is still being prosecuted, and that it's just a very different situation than from the federal cases, where again, like he can wield the pardon power.
Mhm.
One thing that occurs to me there is that let's say hypothetically that he is convicted
Mhm.
before the election. So there's a conviction on the books. many people say, well, he can't, it's not like the federal case because he can't either pardon himself with all the legal uncertainty about whether that's even possible, or just with his control of the Justice Department, kind of make it go away. Say, go into court and try to get it, vacated. But knowing the earlier case law and reasoning about, civil cases, just the basic theories in case, even though it hasn't been litigated. What if what if there's a criminal case? What if there's what if the president is in state prison? It would not surprise me, and it would not be, and nothing would surprise me from the Supreme Court, but it would not surprise me, simply operating within the theory of the existing cases, that a Supreme Court might say, look, he's got to serve his time, but the public has decided he needs to be the president. He is the president for the next 4 years. And the public's decision there trumps, the state of Georgia's punishment needs. So he's going to serve as president, normally as president, and then when he leaves office, he's going to go to prison in Georgia. I would not, and I wouldn't think that was even such a crazy decision. I mean, it's absurd on many levels, but think about it. Think about the contending interests. The American public has decided this person is the president, and so then you say, does a jury's decision in one state basically get to overrule the decision of the whole country? Because clearly he can't be president serving in prison in Georgia. So, I mean, again, these things are these are all the sort of the absurd hypotheticals that Trump brings us to. But again, maybe Kate, in one of our separate, kind of expert interview episodes, or, one of those ones you guys do, we can get into this. But again, I don't think that's impossible at all. I'm not even sure it's a bad decision, even though, in practice it would be terrible for the fact that he would get a 4-year reprieve. But again, you got to think of these things as they apply generally, not just in the specific case. Josh, do you think, what is your general sense, both based on your following, not just this case, but all the other criminal cases he's facing? I have gotten the sense that most people there's kind of a consensus that these charges are stronger than people expected, that it's like a more powerful case than people expected. And I'm not sure what people were expecting. It's not like they just whipped this up. They were working on it for a long time. But is my sense of kind of the public conversation on the mark there? Are you seeing something similar, or no?
Yeah, I am. And I think oddly enough, Josh, I mean, I was trying to put my finger on this, that even before the Fulton County indictment was released, it just felt like the anticipation for it was like somehow, it was very kind of ethereal, but it was somehow just like different than for the federal cases, and obviously for the New York one. It for some reason, it just felt like it was, people were taking it, like, we're just treating it somewhat differently. And I think it goes back to the RICO, the way that Willis laid out the RICO case, which is that, unlike Smith, where he did address the same conduct, Willis just said that, the entire thing, just this entire attempt to reverse the election result from, trying to bully state officials into saying that, Trump actually won Georgia, from the fake electors plot, everything, those were all prongs of a single criminal conspiracy against, basically elements of the federal government and state governments, and against, American democracy. So that, I think, I think a lot of it comes down to the framing. Like, it was strong. I mean, it's strong in the evidence, like in the sense, in the way that she built it. Like, they did a very actually tight job. I think it's sprawling, but still tightly done in terms of how they connect the different schemes, and show how the different people kind of involved work together on different elements of it. But I think it's not just strong in the kind of sturdiness of the construction of the indictment, but in its sweep, in the fact that they basically presented the this history that we are all by now kind of pretty intimately familiar with, the effort to reverse Trump's loss in 2020, but they narrated it in a way that was made it look like what it was, which was a criminal conspiracy. I think that is where a lot of the strength comes from, and that's rhetorical, but also like in a legal sense, as I said. I mean, they just did a good job of kind of showing how like various parts of like how there were various concrete conspiracies tied into the evidence, and then kind of built them all up into this one big thing. Does that answer your
Kate?
question?
Yeah, no, it does.
Okay, thanks for having me, guys.
All right, thanks, Josh. Okay, so I guess while this is all happening, we also have, there's in these days you have the criminal justice side of electoral politics, and then you have the electoral politics side of electoral politics. Okay, what was going on out in the Iowa State Fair?
Yeah, so the Iowa State Fair is kind of the pinnacle of these things that we think of that almost feel a little bit old fashioned now. But it's when, aspiring candidates have to come like wearing their jeans and they have to flip burgers for people and like go visit livestock and butter sculptures and like eat deep fried Twinkies and stuff to kind of like show that they're a person of the people. And they're, especially the Iowa State Fair, they're kind of long-standing traditions. Like the Des Moines Register does it's called a soapbox, where you get to just kind of talk to people who are at the fair, like give a little speech. And now you have Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds doing these fair side chats, ha ha ha, where she kind of asks easy questions to the candidates. And so basically, kind of the whole deal of the Iowa State Fair, it's not like you're going to go and defend your healthcare positions or whatever. It's basically to show like you can be a normal person and be in a crowd of people and come off as, likable and get a little bit of like funny press attention for playing some carnival games and whatever. That's kind of the gist of it. And so it was interesting this year because Trump just like half-assed it so aggressively. He only came for like 2 hours, and this is supposed to be like kind of an all-day affair, right? He like shows up, he doesn't flip burgers, he like sends a surrogate to flip burgers for him, which is hilarious. He's feuding with Kim Reynolds for whatever reason, so he didn't do her little thing. He kind of came, attracted a lot of, hubbub, gave a little bit like the election is stolen, continues to be stolen speech, and then, gets out of there. And it's interesting because it's like in some ways, he doesn't have to do the rigmarole, right? Like when you're a million points up in all these polls, it's like, why would he go kind of ogle a butter cow if he doesn't have to? But it's also kind of funny because Iowa voters in particular tend to be a little bit like uppity, the ones who are kind of politically engaged, like they really like having the first in the nation caucus, the kind of disproportionate power to give or take away momentum to candidates at this kind of like crucial early money stage, where especially those who are less big of names and less well funded, like this is kind of the moment where you've got to make your run if you're going to make it. So all of those things have kind of made Iowa voters a little bit like precious about their role in the proceedings. And Trump is like not even really trying to take it seriously. It's like, he hauls ass all the way to Iowa and then like drops in for a few minutes and leaves. Meanwhile, there was a lot of kind of like fawning coverage of DeSantis in particular, who it seems conducted himself in like a more human way than he has been of late. He's pals with Kim Reynolds, so I think they had some banter. He like had his little daughter up on his shoulders and was walking around, and they did the bumper cars, and then so and comported himself the way you kind of expect a candidate to do. It's a similar story with the others. Like people responded well to kind of Tim Scott's like optimism message. You had Mike Pence putting on the apron, flipping the burgers. I think the most famous kind of Pence moment from the fair was when one guy was walking by him said, "Hey, I'm really glad they didn't hang you."
Wasn't it? Wait, I saw a few I saw a few reports on that moment, and it I saw it portrayed different ways, but it seemed like the main portrayal wasn't like, "Hey, you're a good guy. Glad you weren't hanged by your neck until you died." It was more kind of like, "Yeah, I'm glad they didn't hang you." Just sort of like you suck, but like it was probably an overreach to hang you. So okay, but
Yeah.
yeah, that's kind of where Pence lives these days.
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting that it's now really evident that like Trump is not going to do what you would expect a politician to do of his standing, which is realize you lost in 2020, right? You have done little to nothing to kind of like change anything about yourself as a candidate since then, except get indicted a whole bunch of times. So mathematically, he's got to expand the number of votes he gets to win this time. Okay, there's your high level insight from me, an expert. So it's like you would kind of expect a normal candidate in this position to be at least using these kind of early stage events to test balloon some stuff or spitball some stuff or see if you can, if not like moderate on certain positions, maybe show that you care about certain positions, like try some kind of calculus to see if you can expand your tent just a little bit, just enough to actually win. But he's not doing that at all. I mean, it's so obvious that his quote unquote strategy is going to be to change absolutely nothing. In fact, to campaign less hard than he did last time because he's so up in these primary polls, and not only just kind of like worry about the general when you get there, but probably not really worry about it that much either. And then just for some reason assume that his like election overthrow attempts this time would be successful in a way that they weren't last time, and that's his kind of fallback. Because really the only change we've seen from last go round here is he's caring less and making less of an effort.
Well, two things come to my mind. I mean, one is, I mean, in his defense, kind of worrying about the general when you get there is what he did in 2016, and it worked out for him. Um, Certainly, I mean, I think the horse race polls right now don't actually tell us a lot, and they show Biden a bit ahead, but just a bit, right? And they show them the key to me is they show them both like in the low 40s. Well, it's not going to end up that way.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you have third party candidates who really do in Joe Biden, they're not going to total 16 or 17 or 18% of the vote. That is 100% not going to happen. So those horse race polls don't mean much, but they don't mean nothing, right? Any Democrat would be very unwise to think, look, Joe Biden's got this. So what are we even talking about? And clearly that is not the case. But the other thing that occurs to me about Trump is, the thing you mentioned before, where like he sent a surrogate, right, to flip the burgers. Normally that would be so deadly for any. It's one thing to not show up for something, but to send like a valet or a servant or a footman or something like that to flip burgers, or maybe like, I'm sure he's got burger flippers at Mar-a-Lago. Maybe he brings some kitchen staff to do it, right? But it's almost like, there there are Little Richard used to do this, and I think Morris Day did it too, where some performers, they're making a performance about their haughtiness and highness, where they actually have little attendants, at their performance, like putting up mirrors in front of them and whatever. And Trump is kind of doing something like that, right? It's not that he's just like, I don't care about them, I'll send someone else. He's sending a message. I'm Trump. I'm not going to do a burger. Are you kidding? I'm like Trump. It's that same thing that was what made Apprentice sort of fun to watch, and it's different when it's the president or would be president versus some kind of cartoonish reality show guy, right? Where it's part of his presentation. Look at all of my little servants and attendants and lackeys and stuff like that. But in a broader sense, he has. So as you said, he clearly took a lot of time to fly out there. I don't care if you have your private jet. Flying from Florida to Iowa is a trek. So he was willing to go to a lot of effort, but he needed to send the signal that he's only going to be there for like 90 minutes just to kind of wave and not do the other thing. It also seems pretty clear he's not even going to go to the debate. Why should he? Well, he's 50 points ahead. Like, why should he debate? But he's, that is clearly, it's not just what he can get away with not doing. That is his campaign, to kind of like, I'm Trump. Like, are you kidding? Like, what are we talking about here? And you see that, across the board, and it's a very strange thing, considering that what he is facing right now would be a big crisis for just some random person walking down the street, let alone someone running for president. If you're facing criminal indictments with pretty strong charges in 4 separate jurisdictions, 4 separate trials, I don't even know. I mean, someone somewhere must have gone through and put together the most likely sentences for all the charges. It's got to be decades, many decades. These are tons of serious charges. And in a sense, the whole he is making the point, and I think it's accurate, that the whole primary campaign doesn't even involve him because he's already the nominee. It's kind of a dignity loss fest for all the other people who are stuck under 10%, or in many cases under 5%, just to kind of make idiots out of themselves.
I mean, yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it's undeniable, right? Like, the quote unquote closer polls will have him up by like 20 points instead of 50. I mean, he's got it in the bag. But the thing is, it's the same problem that's plagued Republicans on, every level, which is, if it's really easier for you to win a Republican primary, you might be looking at some problems in the general. And if you are a good general election candidate, you may not survive the Republican primary. And this problem, obviously, we have data points, applies to Trump. And he just, it doesn't seem to concern him. It seems to be, he's kind of operating under this idea that, like, with his brute force and his personality, that he'll somehow do better this time. Maybe because, Biden is not like electrifying people, despite the fact that he didn't exactly electrify people before either. And arguably, then Trump was the incumbent president and Biden was, really struggling with the early campaign and like only came out as front runner, by South Carolina. Things were awful for him for months. I mean, his early campaign was not good. So, I mean, then, and Trump was not indicted then. I mean, everything was kind of more on Trump's side then. And, he lost handily. So I am not really sure why he thinks, when all these factors have kind of gotten worse for him since then, that he's going to be in a better position when he reaches the general by changing absolutely nothing about his campaign or candidacy. It really must just rest on his belief that, like, I don't know, maybe the state legislature in Georgia or whatever will be more swayable to him now. Again, despite the fact that the people who were swayable then are now pretty much either like indicted or unindicted co-conspirators.
Right. Yeah, no, it is a strange and unique. I mean, unique. I mean, it's there's nothing more than unique. The dictionary would tell us, but this is definitely more than unique. It's so unprecedented and crazy. And I do think that we are. I still think that we are not quite figuring just the impact of these things all being litigated during the meat of the presidential campaign. And that's why I actually think Jack Smith is doing the GOP, if not Trump, a favor by doing this early. Say we're going to do this trial in January and February. Now, you can argue, well, the contest may kind of be decided by February. Well, probably not. Normally it would be, but there's decided and there's decided. Is it mathematically decided? Because, look, I have a very high confidence that even if Trump, let's say both of these prosecutors get the schedule more or less what they want, right? Their cases tried in the first 3 months of 2024. I think that even if Trump is convicted on basically all the counts, he's still going to be the nominee, just because that is the nature of his power over this party. But the GOP deserves the chance to rethink it after that happens. And again, I'm not trying to do him a favor. I just think that is better. It is more equitable for civic democracy if the party gets a chance to look at the reality of their candidate in full before they lock in and say, okay, this is our nominee and we're gonna run with this person. But it's not, in my mind, it's not even so much that it's not great running for, having a presidential election where everybody's running, a third of the senators, everybody in the House, president, blah, 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 blah. Everybody's running, and your standard bearer is like in criminal court constantly, going through the everything that is involved in a criminal trial. It's that it makes January 6th the centerpiece of the entire campaign, not just Trump. For every House candidate, for every Senate candidate, it is the issue. And it's a toxic issue for the Republican Party. There's no question about it. I'm not saying everybody's going to lose. I'm not saying Trump's going to lose. But we have seen very clearly that in the cases when January 6th has been front and center around the time of January 6th, and again during the January 6th committee's hearings, it was bad for Republicans. It was incredibly damaging.
So speaking of, we have to talk about this AP poll that came out today that's getting a lot of buzz. The headlines of it, 35% of Americans have a favorable view of Trump and 62% have an unfavorable view. Among Republicans, of course, 7 in 10 view Trump favorably, and about 6 in 10 say they want him to make another run for the White House. And then the other kind of big headline here is 53% of Americans say that they wouldn't support Trump if he's the nominee come November. Which
not great for Trump.
Not great for Trump. The unfavorable thing is even a bit more interesting to me, because I kind of wonder what that percent of the wouldn't support Trump in November is either Republicans kind of lying to the pollsters / themselves, or doing the same thing that we're kind of seeing on the Democratic side, where Biden's numbers are really low, and you can kind of safely assume that once we're closer, once there are no other options, once you see the oppositional force, people will come home. But the unfavorables are interesting because there has been a pretty marked dip in that, particularly since the documents indictment. Like the New York Stormy Daniels one didn't really make much of a dent, and the documents one did. It was
a dent in his unfavorability or his favorability.
So his net favorability rating fell nearly 10 points among Republicans and 5 points among all adults between late May and late July. So the fundamental thing is popularity rates, favorability rates are more stable now than they've been for a lot of our presidential cycles. Like we talk about this with, how Biden is like quote unquote kind of historically low throughout. He's kind of stuck in the mid 40s, which is the same place that Trump was stuck, which it's kind of increasingly seeming like all presidents more or less are going to get stuck in our age of hyperpartisanship, and where you just don't have the party crossover to boost people to like the 60s like you did even just, a couple presidents ago. But I think it's interesting that the documents one is the one that seemed to the degree that it's possible, resonate with people, and that people didn't like that, and they thought it made him look either kind of menacing or stupid or whatever. They just, that one landed in a way that the New York Stormy Daniels thing didn't. And all of this data is, including the AP poll we're talking about right now, is pre-Georgia indictment. So there's all these kind of disparate data points that are, I think it's hard to make a super concrete kind of conclusion from it, but they're all interesting.
Yeah, I think one of the most salient findings of any of these polls, and there's many of them that we've seen over the last couple of years, is the times where they have done a poll and they look at, because both of these presidents or former presidents, both of them are net unpopular in that either their approval rating or their approval rating or favorability rating is net negative. Okay, but it's a zero sum in a one-on-one race. Even if you get some third-party people, still it's basically that. So when they look at those, okay, of the voters who don't like either one of them, since they have to choose, who will they choose? And those people break heavily for Biden. And there's been a number of polls like that, and I don't think that's not terribly surprising, because if you're a Republican, obviously you're totally against Biden. He's a Marxist threat, and all blah 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 blah, all that stuff. But if you are someone who kind of floats between the two parties, or maybe even a kind of a loosely aligned Democrat, what is going to make you that opposed to Joe Biden? Like, you can say like he's too old. Okay, maybe he is too old. But if you're like, man, I'm gonna go to my grave fighting this guy, like it's just not the same kind of thing, right? So I think one of the things that shows us is that the binary of favorability or non-favorability or approval or non-approval just doesn't quite grasp the fullness of the different issues at play in this election, because obviously a lot of people are totally down with Donald Trump, but there are not a lot of people who are kind of like, haven't seen enough of Trump yet to make an opinion. I mean, you got an opinion, and people who are against Trump are really, really, really against him, and that's why that when you mentioned before that number of people who will absolutely never vote for Donald Trump in the general election, say it's 53%. Well, especially people who don't have strong partisan commitments, don't have strong ideological commitments. They can't perfectly predict what they're going to be thinking in 18 months, but that is a pretty acid test thing to say, I will never vote for that person. And it's even more of an acid test thing when you've seen that person be president. This isn't like when, Barack Obama in 2008, or certainly in very different ways, Donald Trump in 2016, we said, oh, yeah, he'd be terrible. Well, you don't have to imagine. We know how he was as president. And so, those things are, you need more granular, kind of tighter questions to really get at what I think we're all trying to get at in those polls. And one other thing I will mention here, and it's something that I've seen a few Republicans, kind of Republican talking heads, influencers, et cetera. And the ones who I've seen say this are ones who are not Trump loyalists, but also the type that they're going to no comment when it's bad news for Trump. Kind of like a I'm not talking about Mitch McConnell, but sort of the Mitch McConnell posture. You kind of, you're not, you don't like him, but you're not never going to attack him, that kind of thing. And these people saying that, like, there are a significant number of Republicans that when Donald Trump gets convicted of a felony, they are never going to vote for him again. Period. Now, in my mind, that doesn't quite connect with my way of just thinking about reality, sort of, right? I mean, everybody's innocent until proven guilty, in the sense of like the state taking away your freedom. But that's not a thing in a political campaign. I can already see what Donald Trump's done. The fact that a jury might convict him of a crime is interesting, but it's hard for me to imagine, and not just because it's Trump, it's hard for me to imagine that having such a unique and determining effect on my vote, because I just have my eyes open. I know what he's about. And so it's a little hard for me to imagine that at least in a, caricature or, generic sense, that you're a Republican saying, deep state, big, rigged election. And if he's convicted, you say, dude, I was with you, but you're convicted of a crime now. What can I say? We're done. That just doesn't connect. But I get the sense that it is a thing for a non-trivial number of Republicans. And as I think we always have to remember, we're not talking about like, a candidate Trump in a general election going from like 45% support to 20, right? Of course that's not going to happen. But shedding 5 or 6% is that's it. It's done, right? It's over. So who knows?
One other poll we wanted to talk about is this Emerson poll out of New Hampshire that was released this week. And, the unsurprising headline is that it has Trump at 49. So, okay, it's not a nail biter here. But, then you had Chris Christie coming in second with 9, and then DeSantis back in third with 8, and then you have Tim Scott and then Doug Burgum. So,
which most people don't even know he's running. So
right.
That's very impressive that he's like beating Nikki Haley and like all these other people. Pence.
Right. So, okay, but and the thing is, as you said in the intro, like the difference between 9 and 8 points is like, I mean, it's not all that real. But when these caucuses / primaries start happening, if DeSantis is getting third, that is, to put it articulately, not good for him, because his whole pitch is like, I am the electable Trump, right? Well, okay, electable Trump, if you're in third place, that's not very electable traditionally. And we're hearing from Tim Miller, who's with the Bulwark, he was like talking to some DeSantis people. The grand plan seems to be that DeSantis gets a bunch of like seconds and thirds as they go through the primaries, and then
what, Trump dies?
Or force a brokered convention. Like that is kind of the game plan in August. I mean, it's Chris Christie has been floating this. It's ridiculous. It's silly. It's the pipe dream of a candidate who's getting single digits in the polls, but still needs the people around him to tell him that there's a way that he could become president. I mean, it's ridiculous. And this kind of just, you can't even call it a collapse, really. I mean, almost like a collapse from the narrative, I guess. But I mean, what's he doing? What's he going to do? I mean, say even that DeSantis kind of, after this fair appearance where he seemingly did pretty well, he turns it around and people in Iowa start liking him more and people in New Hampshire start liking him more. And let's say he placed second in those two. Okay, next we're on to South Carolina. I mean, and which is getting into, as you said in the intro, the kind of like traditional Southern evangelical land where Trump is king, absolutely king. I mean, even more than he is in Iowa, where he is also king. But so it's like, where's the reversal going to come? Are you like banking on Florida, which is also Trump's home state? Like, what's the game plan?
Well, that was actually, speaking of people in the news, in 2008, that was literally Rudy Giuliani's plan. He was going to skip the early states, and he was going to, kind of bring on the turbocharge in Florida. And, because his argument is like, look, there's no delegates in the early states, so who cares? I'm not even going to play there. I'm going to focus on the real states, Florida, whatever comes after Florida. And people bought that as a plan, but as Rudy, demonstrated, for anybody who needed to see it demonstrated, you're not going to be alive when Florida comes along. It really doesn't matter that there's not that many delegates. Your campaign is going to have fallen apart, and the whole DeSantis thing is it was never a real thing. It was all narrative driven, and it was really an artifact of the fact that after there was this window of time, 6 or 8 weeks, 6 or 10 weeks, something like that, after the 2022 midterm election, where a lot of GOP elites and GOP funders looked at the result and said, fuck, this dude is a fucking albatross. We need to get rid of him, or we're toast. And DeSantis was the solution, and he sort of played into that. But the reality was, Trump never stopped being the king of the Republican Party, and it just there was an article in the Times a few days ago. They used the metaphor of a Trump eclipse, basically that when Trump was indicted early in the year in New York, and from then the successive number of indictments that we all know about, that Trump and his indictments basically blotted out the sun, and DeSantis has been a wilting plant, right? That is dying in the prolonged eclipse. But that is just very wrong, and it really makes me wonder it's such a misunderstanding of the political moment and the dynamics of the political moment that it really makes me wonder what the people who wrote the article are thinking. It is unquestionably true that the indictments hastened the process. It sped everything up, because suddenly you have all the candidates having to spend all their time defending Donald Trump. And it's really hard running against someone as their top defender. It's like impossible. But the reason they had to do that, the reason all of these things, the reason these things happen is because Trump was the head of the party, right? It's not that the indictments came along. It's that he was always the head of the party. So it's not, again, it's misunderstanding cause and effect. Being the head of the party forced everyone to start defending him, and meant that their campaign started to collapse. But it was always the fact that he was always the head of the party meant that DeSantis was never going to go anywhere, right? So it's this basic cause and effect thing that I think people don't really realize. Although, again, it is true, it sped up the process. There's no question about that. It would have taken longer to play out, but it was still going to be the same process, and that's I'm very confident of that.
All right.
Well, I guess that is all we have for this week. We I think now we think that the table is set. All 4 of the indictment bundles that we expected but didn't know about are now formal. But who knows, right? Who knows? Do we really know this is all the indictments that are going to be? I'm not just speaking, jocularly. We don't know. We don't know they're not going to be superseding indictments or completely new things, right? The guy's committed a lot of crimes. But in any case, at least the ones that we were expecting are now all out there. And when there is breaking new news, we will be back with little Instapods like we did yesterday. And for the normal weekly show. We will be back, and we'll talk to you next week.
All right. See you then. The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.